Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Will here. Great to have you guys with us today. As some of you might have seen, I did a video a few weeks back with Mischa Wilmers, a friend of mine. In this video, I interviewed him in Chinese and we discussed a number of topics, a few of which I think are worth exploring in more detail in English in today's video. So I've invited him back again. Mischa has this amazing story whereby he learned Mandarin for about 4 years, having never learnt tone. He had an advanced level of comprehension and ability to express himself in the language, but people couldn't understand what he was saying because of the problems of tones. So today I've invited him back to kind of explore how he went from this lousy tones to like a really excellent level in tones. He's also written a blog post which documents his progress with a series of recordings which like demonstrate this incredible transformation, this incredible progress. Also, myself and Mischa have been collaborating on a project which we're going to announce at the end of this video, so I'd really appreciate it if you could stay tuned right through to the end. Awesome. Thanks guys, let's get started.
First started learning Chinese, I didn't really realize the importance of tones. This is something I mentioned in the video that we did in Chinese. So like I began by learning Chinese, approaching it almost in a similar way to the way that you would learn any other European language. You focus on, the vowels, the consonants, that dimension of the pronunciation, but you don't really focus that much on tones. They're not really a concept in European languages. And the other experience I had of learning French at school, and at that time I just tried to imitate, the way that French people speak as best as I could, and was able to be understood pretty well. But when I started learning Chinese, initially I kind of adopted a similar approach. For a long time I thought I was doing quite well because I didn't have major issues with like initials and finals, consonants and vowels. Like a lot of learners, problems started arising later on, where like I'd been studying for a number of years and I've since realized this is like quite a common phenomenon. I could speak Chinese, like not like really fluently, but like, not too bad. But a lot of the time I would get these kind of blank stares back, like people hadn't really understood exactly what I meant, or I might have to rephrase it or repeat myself. Chinese people are very polite. And so one of the reasons I hadn't fully realized the scale of the problem was partly because of my background in European languages, but also because when seeking feedback from native speakers, tutors, a lot of the time, they didn't want to tell me the truth about quite how bad my tones were, to the extent that they often couldn't understand me. The consequences of it are different to bad pronunciation in other languages, because as I said, it's basically not being able to express yourself clearly or be understood. So it's at that level of importance. When you're learning in the UK, the kinds of conversations I was used to having were quite general. And if you're having general conversations with people, it can be quite easy to gloss over when misunderstandings occur. But say, for example, we're having a conversation now. Imagine you don't quite understand what I've just said. Like you kind of understand 50%, but because of my pronunciation, you somehow didn't understand the other 50%. If you wanted, if out of politeness, to shield me from that fact, you could just respond something quite generic about the general topic that we're talking about. And then I would never know that you'd not understood. And so what I discovered when I started going down this rabbit hole of tones was that a lot of the conversations I'd been having with Chinese people were of that nature. Reached that stage of a kind of realization that my tones weren't good. And that came sort of, as I say, about 4 years in. Everyone previously had been so polite to me. Like I suddenly had one language exchange partner, a Chinese woman who attended a language exchange event. And she suddenly made me quite brutally aware that my tones were not good. One of the things I found was that when I tried to look into what I should be doing, all of the advice that I was receiving was telling me, you should have done this from the start. Like, you won't be able to correct it later. It will be virtually impossible to do later. I found it really disheartening because I couldn't really find any case studies, people who documented themselves basically reaching a certain level of Chinese with bad tones and then documented the process of amending that. They call it fossilization, where the mistakes are so ingrained and so in place that it's really difficult to change them later on. My instinct then was to change my tones and improve them, but at the same time, like document the process. I think like initially, like the issue was not being able to hear the tones clearly, the differences between them, particularly second tone, the rising tone, and third tone, the low tone. And so I had to like really practice that. That didn't take too long. I think getting the fundamentals in place of being able to hear the differences when spoken slowly and in isolation, it's important to mention that, because I'm not talking about when native speakers speak at full speed. That's a different thing. It wouldn't be too hard to distinguish between them, because we can do that in English, right? Everybody can hear the difference between an exclamation and a question with a rising tone in English. Like if I say what, or if I say what, everyone can hear that tonal distinction. So anyway, the first thing was to get the fundamentals down in terms of being able to hear it and produce them in isolation. And then quite swiftly after that, I moved to like the 20 tone pair combinations. So this is something that's super important, like being able to not just produce them in isolation, but because Chinese vocabulary appears in pairs normally, there's 20 potential combinations, and to be able to pronounce each one. Then I went back to all my vocabulary and started testing myself. Like, did I really know like the tone for each vocabulary item? Quite a lot of them, maybe even 40, 50%. I'd kind of misremembered them when I tested myself with them on flashcards. Yeah, at first it's really difficult to remember the tone, but quite quickly develop a habit being able to do that. Moving on to sort of full sentences. And one of the most important things I did at this point was hire a tutor. And not just any tutor, but one that was actually willing to correct me on all my mistakes. They're so used to hearing kind of atonal Mandarin from foreigners that their first reaction to me was sort of, your tones are fine already, don't worry about tones. You know, all foreigners have an accent. So they were kind of, they had a very low standard. I got the sense they didn't really know what to do to help me. But eventually I found a tutor willing to be brutal enough to just correct me on all the mistakes I was making. So we'd go through whole sentences where I'd just speak naturally and she would correct me on everything. And then I started developing like a sense for myself, a sense of when I'd said it wrong. So I would correct myself before my tutor had a chance to correct me. And once I was at that stage, things became a lot more easy. I'd have to train myself for a while to really think about the tones as I was pronouncing them. Because I often hear people say, oh, you shouldn't like think too hard about the tones. But I think at first, because we don't come from tonal languages, so we do need to expend quite a lot of effort in that. The point about that is that that's a temporary phase. It like becomes a lot easier, because if you practice that enough at it, that it basically becomes automatic. But at first, like, you have to go through a phase, at least I did, of sounding a bit more robotic, having to think about it a lot and being a bit slower.
No, I do totally agree. I did have like a very long phase of like sounding a bit like a robot. And I was even told, like, with enough deliberate practice, like Mischa says, it does become automatic and you don't have to think about it as much. Same as like playing a musical instrument, for example, like at the start when you first learn a new piece.
Right.
Very difficult. You're going to have to think about like what you're doing a lot more. But after, like, as a motor skill, like with enough practice, it just becomes automatic.
I'm kind of really glad that I like recorded like the clips that I did, because if you look back, something that's interesting is that a lot of learners, when in the latest blog that I wrote, where like I put like 4 clips side by side, each one sort of in order of like when it was, the date when it was recorded. So the first one was 2020, then there was one in 2021, one in 2022, one more recently. For a native speaker, like the biggest change in like tones was between the second and the third clip, because that was a 6-month period in which I like drilled tones. But if you ask the average learner to listen to those clips, most learners who haven't trained tone perception will think that the biggest difference is between the third clip and the fourth clip. And the reason for that is because in the third clip, I'm at that phase where I'm getting the tones correct, but I'm speaking more slowly and almost like a little bit robotic. My tutor helped, and I would get my tutor to pronounce them slowly and deliberately, you know, in isolation and in tone pairs. So there's some really good YouTube videos from Yo-Yo Mandarin is one of them. They pronounce each tone pair, they go through each tone pair, and you can repeat along. And if you're at a phase where you're sort of trying to the distinctions, then you can kind of slow it down and like listen really carefully so sure you can hear that like there's a rise or like it's a low tone. Another thing was that like I had received some instruction from previous tutors just briefly on tones, particularly like the third tone. Learners go through this thing with the third tone, where like your tutor will very often like draw a semicircle. That will make you think that like it's kind of a fall and then a sharp rise, kind of like whenever I tried to pronounce third tone, I would try and do it with a really sharp rise. But if unless third tone is placed at the end of a sentence, like as the final character, it doesn't have a rise. So the tail is cut off. And nobody ever told me that before. That was pointed out. And then when it was pointed out, I could like clearly hear it. Oh yeah, they're not actually doing the rise. There was a bit of like reading into the theory of it. They call it tone sandy. getting to grips with various rules about changes in tones. Like, for example, when there's two third tones together, the first one becomes a second tone.
I remember like one day, like I wanted to say like "qiu," like a penguin, right, in Mandarin, and I suddenly realized, like, man, this is really hard to do a third tone and a second tone. Like, why is that? And then I heard a native speaker say it, and I was like, oh, it's like pronounced like that. It's not like you're not trying to go "qi" really hard, right?
It's interesting you say that, actually, because like I think some people will notice that naturally. Like I needed it pointed, I needed it pointing out, but once it was pointed out, it was like really obvious. I think that can be really useful sometimes. Just like you need something like that pointed out by like a good instructor or a tutor or someone who can like tell you actually how it works. And then I remember, you know, like, there were things like that where, for example, like some of the tone pair combinations that like foreigners typically get wrong. For example, 水平, like that kind of 3-2 like low tone followed by a rise. It doesn't exist in English. I just hadn't picked up that tone pattern naturally at all. And so I would always pronounce that wrong. And then like I remember once it was pointed out that this starts low and then there's a rise. From then on, I couldn't unhear it or like hear it wrong again or pronounce it wrong again. I think that's really important to say. It's just like sometimes you need your attention to be placed in the right direction.
Definitely.
Or you need someone to tell you where to place your attention. Because sometimes it's not your ear that's like the problem. It's actually just the focus of your attention is in the wrong place because you don't come from a tonal background.
It's going to be very controversial saying this, but like as adults, we're not in that critical period where we can hear and distinguish very clearly between like all the exact sounds that exist in this world. And there's like quite a lot of neuroscience to kind of back this up. So it will mean that if you're coming from a background whereby you don't have tones as explicitly in your own language, then it's going to be very, very difficult for you to pick up on these completely natural.
Right.
Getting lots and lots of exposure to the language is probably not going to be sufficient. So it's really important to kind of have this explicit instruction.
I'm sure that you've had it a lot of times where people have said, your tones are good because you're just naturally talented. They have this idea that you just probably pick them up. As I say, luckily, like I recorded myself at a time when my tones were terrible, so no one can accuse me of having just this natural talent. Like it's very clear that like I had to put a lot of work into this. But it's like when I hear your story, it's the same for you. Like at the beginning, like you had to drill it. Like I haven't really met anyone who coming from a non-tonal background was just able to immerse in the language and pick tones up. I have met people that thought that was what they'd done or that thought that would work. But in most cases, you hear them speak Chinese and their tones really aren't that good, like often incomprehensible. So, and this is a huge problem in the Chinese learning community in general. So there's this idea, and I used to think it, that you just need to immerse more. You just need to just listen more and naturally mimic without having to kind of skipping the tone drills phase. And I would also prefer it if that was the case, because then I wouldn't have had to do the stuff that I did. But it's not.
So for that reason, I'd kind of recommend that if you are just starting out, like from the start, like I think looking back, it would have probably been best for me for like the first month just to be practicing pronunciation,
right,
and try and not do anything else. Like and try and stand tones and try and really get that down early on. Obviously, like so Matsure, Chris, like he's made a good point in like his previous videos where he kind of said that like within a few months you can get a decent accent in a language, like if you deliberately practice and you spend a lot of time doing it. But it will probably take you years to get really, really good, to the point where like people start to doubt like, are you a native speaker, etc. Right. So you shouldn't be expecting like in that first month of tone training to like come out and be like, oh, I speak perfect Mandarin. But you can get pretty decent in a short amount of time if you do spend time doing it.
One of the reasons that I documented my journey in terms of improvement in tones is because the advice that you get from people who have really good tones is like, do it from the beginning or else it's impossible to change. So if you are an intermediate or even an advanced stage, I meet lots of sort of advanced learners who have advanced comprehension skills, but bad tones. Like if that's the stage that you're in, like it absolutely is possible to amend, like, and in a reasonable time frame as well, because as I said, the biggest difference in those clips was this 6-month period where I was just focusing on tones every day for half an hour, maybe to an hour during the lockdown period. Those mistakes that I'd been saying wrong over and over again, like my teacher had to correct me on them so many times before I got out of those habits because they were so deeply ingrained. But it absolutely is possible to get out of if you do it for long enough.
Amazing the results Mischa's got from that. So yeah, I would definitely recommend, if you're in that situation, like, please do go and see Mischa's blog and use some of the methods that we've kind of mentioned today. But you have also kind of proven with a bit of a case study here that it can be done. I really don't want anyone to fall in the trap of being like, oh, I've learned Chinese for like what, 5-10 years. I can't just get rid of my foreign accent now. It's like it's there. So as long as you're willing to invest the time, like, it can be done, as Mischa's shown.
If you're someone who's worried about your tones, or you know your tones are not good and you want to do something about it, that's kind of a good position to be in, because it's better than being in the position that's maybe even more common. You don't know that your tones are bad. You're not aware of the extent to which this is causing communication barriers because of the issues I raised earlier. I think the first step is realizing that there's a problem, because we can't hear it. If you listen back to the recordings, like the first couple of recordings when my tones were not good, I didn't know that they weren't good. I thought that I sounded pretty Chinese. Like, it's really important at that stage, or like kind of at any stage, like, don't rely on your own ear. You might think you have a good ear. Like, I thought I had a decent ear. That kind of overconfidence is not a good position to be in. I think it's better to be kind of underconfident, if anything, and like realize you have a problem and want to do something about it.
And just then to go from there, not just rely on like listening for thousands of hours, like blindly hoping that one day they'll just come out perfectly, because it's probably going to save you a lot of time in the long run. Like, who knows, maybe if someone generally, I've never seen anyone listen to like 8,000 hours of Mandarin and then start speaking, like, maybe their tones would be fine. I doubt it, but who knows? But the fact is,
I mean, I had some. I didn't listen to anything like that much, but I listened a lot, like, before I started tones.
Exactly.
And like, so there's the first two clips. The first clip in 2020, the second clip in 2021. In between those two clips, I'd listened for hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of Chinese. It was during like lockdown, and I was listening to a lot of Chinese, and the tones are no better from one clip to the next. That's a year apart. There was no progression. So I don't really believe that, like, on its own, that wasn't sufficient to have any real progress in tones. Yeah.
No, and I think for most people it won't be. I think it would save an awful lot of time if people were to focus on them and involve some deliberate practice with corrective feedback. I think it's probably a lot better way to try and learn them. Thank you so much for coming on today, Mischa. I think we've covered some really important topics, and hopefully that would have been useful for a lot of people who want to know a bit more about learning tones.
As I mentioned at the start of the video, myself and Mischa have a special announcement. After ourselves struggling with tones and managing to resolve the issue, we've been discussing how best to help learners do the same. So we're really happy to announce our first ever tones masterclass, in which we'll try and tackle some of the issues and help learners of all abilities improve their tones. This is the first of which is going to be taking place on Wednesday, the 23rd of August at UK time 6 p.m.
So the masterclass is going to be an interactive session. It will be led by us, me and Will, for a small group, and we'll guide you through basically all of the core principles and techniques that you need in order to speak with accurate and natural sounding tones. We've also been really fortunate to have had the input from Professor Karen Chung, who's a leading phonetics expert at National Taiwan University and also a really fluent Mandarin speaker. You might not be able to speak with perfect tones after the hour is over, obviously within that time frame. That's not really possible. But what you will have is you'll leave with the knowledge and the resources that you need in order to ultimately take your tones to the highest levels.
We've made the session really affordable, as we don't think learning tones to a decent level and eventually mastering tones should break the bank. This Tones Masterclass will be suitable for people of all abilities. As long as you're interested in learning tones and improving tones, this session is suitable for you. I've provided a link in the description below in which you can go and reserve your place. Obviously this will be done on a first come first served basis, so if you are interested, please do go and click on that link below to sign up. We'll look forward to seeing you there. Cheers, bye for now.